All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to Written in the Stars. This is Altadena Library District. If you're watching on the internet later or now, if you're unfamiliar with us, we're near Pasadena, California. We're an independent library district. And today we have special guests on a special day. It's Spring Equinox. And we have with us Becca Tarnas. And Becca is a astrologer, a counselor, a scholar, an artist, a writer. I first found out about Becca by hearing a podcast where she's discussing, I think it was a book based on her PhD work, and it's about Jung, who I love, and Tolkien, who I'm super interested in. An amazing book, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes in the recorded version, and you can check it out from the library. We have a copy on the way. Well, our copy went missing because someone loved it so much, I think. Anyway, without further ado, Becca Tarnas, welcome to Altadena Library District's Zoom room, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak about the current astrological transits with all of you. And this astrological presentation, it is being offered at this time to honor the equinox. So it's the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere, marking when the days begin to grow longer. And at the same time, it's the autumn equinox in the Southern Hemisphere, so marking when the nights begin to grow longer. And that word equinox, it means equal night. For the day and night everywhere on our globed planet is the same length of time on this day. So for us in the Northern Hemisphere, as the daylight grows, the earth begins to reawaken from winter. So the green shoots, they're unfurling from the ground and on the leaves of the trees. And you've probably noticed crocuses and daffodils and tulips opening and the fruit trees coming into flower and the birds returning once more to grace our skies with song. It really is a time of rebirth and renewal. And in the astrological calendar, the vernal equinox marks when the sun shifts from the last winter water sign of Pisces into the cardinal spring fire sign of Aries. So today I'm going to be offering a short introduction to the discipline of archetypal astrology and speaking about a few of the key components of the astrological system, as well as giving an introduction to the basic theory behind what archetypes are. And then in order to give a good astrological forecast, you really have to go back first. And so I'm actually going to speak a little bit about one of the major past alignments that we experienced within the last decade or so, starting in about 2007. And that's going to just give you some context of what we've been coming out of first. And then moving forward, I do want to touch on what happened in 2020, because that was definitely a very catalytic year. And then moving into what's happening right now and unfolding through this year. So that's kind of our general trajectory of where we're going to be going. But before I really dive in, I wanted to ask those of you who are here a question. And I should say, if you feel inspired, there's no pressure to, but if you feel inspired, it's always lovely for me to get to see your faces, just because it feels a little bit more like we're in a space together. That being said, I completely understand what it is like to tune into a talk when you're in your bathrobe, in bed, or out on a walk or something like that. So there's no pressure. But hello, it's so lovely to see you. It's nice to have a sense of connection to who I'm speaking to. And on that same note, I did want to get a little bit of a sense using the chat what the level of astrological knowing is in this group. And I'll give you a few kind of multiple choice options to pop in here. You could say, I know nothing, or I know my sun sign, or I know my big three. If you don't know what your big three means, then you probably won't know what they are. You could be a professional astrologer. Whatever level of knowledge you have in astrology, please feel free to just pop that in the chat below. And that way I will have a sense of who I'm speaking to and what would be best to illuminate so that you really understand going forward. And so as you're popping that in the chat, we have someone who knows their sun sign. That's fantastic. And someone else knows their big three. Now I'll clarify, the big three is your sun sign, your moon sign, and also your rising sign. Someone else is fairly familiar with their natal chart, which is the birth chart where the planets were when you were born. Currently studying a Jungian-based psychodynamic therapy in school. That's great. Knowing sun and rising sign, a beginner, knowing big three. Wonderful. Well, the kind of astrology that I do focuses primarily on the planets. So I'm actually not going to be focusing much on the signs here. Now, the signs are the zodiac, the belt of the zodiac, these constellations that we use in astrology to measure the placement of the planets in front of them. That's what gives us a sense of where things are. But what really are the drivers in astrology, kind of the main characters of what's going on, those are the planets. So 10 planets that I work with in my practice, those are the visible planets, the luminaries, the sun and the moon, and then the ones that are visible to the naked eye, which are sometimes called the ancient planets or the classical planets. And those are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then I work with three that were discovered in modernity. Some astrologers will call these the transpersonal planets. This is Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So altogether 10. Some astrologers refer to this as the classic modern 10, because there's a bunch of other bodies being discovered as well. But we have a really good understanding of the meaning of these 10. Now, astrology is an ancient discipline, once was considered the queen of the sciences, and one of the oldest symbolic hermeneutics that we have available. And astrology is the interpretive study of the heavens. It's this discerning of correlations between the cyclical alignments of the planets and then the archetypal patterns of human experience. Yet, astrology, it has been intensely rejected by the modern Western paradigm. And some would consider it the paragon of superstition in our rational age. This queen of the sciences, it's been rejected and degraded in our own time. It's often seen as the province of anti-intellectual newspaper columns for the gullible. Now, the astrological system actually emerged in various cultures around the world. Every culture has some kind of relationship between the human being and the sky. Every ancient culture does. And so the kind of astrology that I practice comes out of a lineage of so-called Western astrology, which is actually informed by older roots in Egyptian and Mesopotamian astrology. But there are also forms of astrology, Chinese astrology, Vedic astrology. There's traditional Hellenistic astrology. There was medieval European astrology. And then that evolved into modern Western astrology and depth psychology. Now, the kind of astrology that I'm doing is not newspaper horoscopes. And so there's this focus on the planets and the aspects and looking at the archetypes or the qualities that are associated with the planets. And one thing that's important to keep in mind with astrology is a recognition that the positions of the planets aren't actually causing events to unfold on Earth in some physical sense. It's not like it's a gravity effect or neutrinos or nanoparticles or something. The correlations that we see, they're too complex, they're too nuanced, they're too poetic, and also open to our own engagement and participation to just be a physical cause. And so the way astrologers understand it is it's a correlation. Or if you're familiar with Jungian terminology, it's a synchronicity. And so to give you a metaphor for this, if you think of a clock, and that clock says that it's 4:13 p.m., the clock isn't causing it to be 4:13. It's just correlating with that. It's indicating this is what time it is. And that is the case as well for astrology. The positions of the planets are not causing these events to unfold like a grand cosmic clock. They are indicating the quality of time here on Earth. Now, some of the value of practicing astrology, it gives us a deeper understanding of world history and a contextualization for the events of our everyday lives. It also can be really helpful for personal insight. If you are exploring your own psyche, your psychology, astrology will provide a map that actually allows you to get several sessions deeper and figure out, well, what are the complexes you're working with? And that can be true at a personal level. It can be true interpersonally as well, better understanding your relationships. And really it indicates that there's this profound archetypal dimension, this patterning that runs through the cosmos. And so with archetypal astrology, one is really learning an astronomical language and a symbolic language simultaneously. You need to understand a certain amount about planets and their orbits and the timing of those orbits, how they come into relationship with each other, what are called aspects. These are the alignments between planets. And yet you also have to understand the archetypal nature, the meaning of each of the planets, or again, the archetype associated with them. Now, each planet is associated with this universal principle or a kind of thematic category that's known as an archetype. And now, where does the archetypal perspective come from? I want to give you just a brief history of the concept of archetypes so that you can draw on that for this knowledge. And in order to do that, we have to go back about 2,500 years to ancient Greece. And there we encounter Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato, and his teacher Socrates. Now, Plato was the first to articulate in philosophical language this concept of archetypes. And for him, he called them ideas, like ideas with a capital I, or forms. They were the eternal forms. And each of these ideas informed the world that we see around us, giving it its form, giving it what we see. And so let me give you a concrete example. When I look out at a forest, I see many, many trees, many different species of tree, but even with the same species, there's many varieties of tree. But I still recognize that they're trees. And from Plato's perspective, they're all trees to the extent that they participate in the archetype or the idea or the form of treeness, tree with a capital T. And for Plato, that perfect archetypal form of tree dwelt in some transcendent realm, some kind of sacred realm that we could remember from before our birth, but that it wasn't part of this world. This world participated in it, but it was somehow separate or transcendent. Let me give you another example that Plato likes to give. Think of horses. There are many different types of horses, many different breeds and colors and sizes. Some are fast, some are slow and sleepy, but they are all horses to the extent that they participate in the form of horse with a capital H. And again, this perfect transcendent horse dwells in some sacred realm, some heavenly transcendent realm. For a more abstract example, you can think of beauty with a capital B. And we can think of more diverse expressions of beauty. We recognize beauty in a blossoming rose, but we also recognize it in a sunset or an exquisite landscape or a beautiful painting or in our beloved's face. We recognize beauty in all these very different forms, but we still know, we sense, they're beautiful. And for Plato, they're all beautiful to the extent that they participate in that archetypal form or idea of beauty. So some archetypes or some forms are more specific and concrete, like the tree or like the horse, and some are more abstract and yet tangible, like beauty or like the true or the good, or justice. So these were the things that Plato was focused on. Now, his student Aristotle brought forward a different idea, very similar in some ways. It's addressing the same issue and yet also very divergent. What Aristotle spoke about was the idea of universals. And so when he looked out at the forest, he recognized all the many different trees. But for him, he saw our ability to recognize all that these were all trees as a capacity of the human mind to abstract this category of tree from the trees. So he saw the universal principle of tree as immanent to the tree. It's in the tree itself, and it's in the human mind to be able to abstract that or understand it. But Aristotle didn't see it as something transcendent, as something dwelling in some other realm that Plato saw. Now, if you've ever seen the painting, the Renaissance painting by Raphael of the School of Athens, it's in the Vatican, and at the center, it's all these Greek philosophers, and at the center, you have Plato and Aristotle side by side, and Plato is gesturing upwards and Aristotle is gesturing outwards. And those two different gestures capture the essence of these two different theories of universals. Plato says they're transcendent, and Aristotle says, no, they're immanent. And so these two Greek men, yes, they are actual figures of history, and we have some of their writings, but in some ways they're also more like these mythic figures at this point. One symbolizing this more transcendent way of understanding how universals relate to particulars, and the other saying, no, they're immanent. They're part of this world, and they're part of the categories of our human mind. Now those two streams evolved through history for 2,500 years. And so I'm going to skip through that history and come instead to Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, who was one of the founders of depth psychology. He developed what's called analytical psychology, early 20th century in Switzerland. And Jung recognized the archetypes as psychological, as part of the human psyche. And for him, he identified them in some ways as figures. And so he gave them names such as the Great Mother, or the Divine Child, or the Shadow, or the Anima, or the Hero, or the Wise Old Man. And these figures he saw as kind of symbolizing the different archetypal complexes of the human psyche. He recognized them as the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Now, through most of his career, Jung saw these as interior to the human psyche only. But he started to notice this phenomenon of synchronicity, this patterning where an inner experience that an individual is having might be mirrored by an outer event, that it was this meaningful coincidence that would perfectly reflect what was going on for them interiorly, and yet there was no way the interior state could have caused that. And in astrology, we recognize that in some ways, astrology is a universally visible and continuously ongoing synchronicity, a correlation between an outer event, the positions of the planets, and an inner human experience, or the events unfolding on Earth as well. It doesn't just have to be in the interior dimension. And so just as Jung, over the course of his lifetime, realized archetypes aren't just interior, they're not just psychological, they're part of the world itself. That's what astrology affirms as well. So I want to give some historical examples of astrological correlations in the world transits. And I want to begin by looking at the 1960s. Everyone kind of knows the 1960s was a bit different. It was a very revolutionary period. There were many different social movements unfolding. It was a very kind of explosive, transformational, change-oriented period. And we can think of the different social revolutions that took place then. The women's movement, the civil rights movement, and the Black liberation movement, the sexual revolution, the gay rights revolution, the psychedelic revolution. There was the birth of the ecological or environmental movement, There were technological breakthroughs during that time, such as the moon landing. Really was a time of cultural upheaval and social transformation. Now, it so happens that during that whole decade of the 1960s, from 1960 to 1972, two planets were in alignment with each other, in conjunction, or visibly next to each other in the night sky. This was Uranus and Pluto. And now the archetypes that astrologers associate with Uranus and Pluto. Uranus is the archetype of liberation, of freedom, of awakening. Uranus is the revolutionary. It's the trickster. It's the awakener. Uranus brings change. It brings upheaval. It's sudden. It's unexpected. It's lightning quick. It's always oriented toward what's new, different, exciting, cutting edge, technological, innovative. And then Pluto is the archetype of the depths, of the underworld, of intensities and extremes. Pluto relates to power. It's the elemental powers of nature. Think of the eruption of a volcano, or the shifting of tectonic plates, or the hunting instinct of a wild animal. Pluto is intense, it's libidinal, it's primal, it's instinctual. It also relates to the underworld, what's oppressed and repressed. And that can be the sexual underworld, the urban underworld, the criminal underworld, the mythological underworld, the religious. So that's the archetype of Pluto. It's kind of complex archetype, but it empowers and drives to extremes what it touches. And when you bring Uranus and Pluto together archetypally, we see this awakening of these deep Dionysian impulses, the awakening of movements for change and transformation, the liberation of the oppressed, the liberation of those who have been pushed down into the underworld, who have been relegated, who have been demonized. And this, in a lot of ways, is exactly what we saw through the 1960s, just as these two planets were in alignment. Now you would say, okay, well, maybe that's just a coincidence that that happened. But if we go back through history, what was happening in the sky when the French Revolution happened? Well, it turns out that Uranus and Pluto were again in alignment in the 1790s, correlating with not only the French Revolution, but also the Haitian Revolution at the exact same time, the birth of the feminist movement, the women's movement, with the publication of Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. It was an era of major scientific breakthroughs in paleontology, the discovery of deep time. So again, a really revolutionary era. And indeed, if we trace the alignments of Uranus and Pluto through history, each time they come into major axial alignment, so either where they're next to each other, like the new moon, or they're in opposition, like the full moon, or they're in a square, 90-degree angle, like the quarter moon, we see these periods in history where there are major revolutions that unfold around the world. And certain movements are especially activated and empowered during those times, such as feminism and the women's rights movement. Or the abolitionist movement and Black power movements and civil rights movements. So those are two major streams that we've seen correlate with Uranus-Pluto alignments. Now, interestingly, the next time Uranus and Pluto came into alignment was from 2007 to 2020. So they moved from the conjunction of the 60s to the 90-degree square of the last decade or so, this next revolutionary period. And this has been a time of major political upheaval, protests and social revolutions, worldwide economic instability, mass migrations. And a lot of the social movements of the last decade have actually mirrored the social movements of the 1960s. So the gender revolution, the passage of gay marriage as a law in so many different countries, the Me Too movement as part of the women's rights movement, the movement for Black lives. There's also been technological breakthroughs, yet again, from smartphones and social media to the New Horizons spacecraft. There has been a dawning awareness of the ecological crisis in climate change. Just like during the 1960s with the psychedelic revolution, starting in about 2006 began the psychedelic renaissance. So again, all these threads and these themes that have carried forward and that we can trace through history. Now, there's much more I could say about that, but I want to move forward because when Uranus and Pluto are in alignment, sometimes they're joined by another faster moving planet. And in this example, I want to bring in Saturn. Now, Saturn is the archetype of hard work and discipline and limits. Saturn is hard, concrete, material reality. Saturn is time, it is finitude, it's endings, it's death and dying and mortality. It's the hard things in life. It's the pain, it's the loss, it's the suffering. But Saturn is also what matures us. It's what gives us a sense of responsibility and commitment. It's the capacity to see something through to the end. It's the wisdom of experience. And when Saturn comes into alignment with Uranus and Pluto, it can sometimes have a very problematic effect. So as an example, when Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto have formed what's called a T-square configuration, so when they're opposite to each other and then there's a third one forming a square with it, this has only happened twice in the last century. The first time was 1929 to 31, correlating exactly with the Great Depression. The next time it happened was 2008 to 2011, correlating exactly with the Great Recession. So there tends to be an intensified sudden collapse of structures that correlates with this. We can even go back to the prior century, to the 19th century, and the Saturn, Uranus, Pluto T-square of that time correlated with the Long Depression. Now, if we focus particularly on the combination of Saturn with Pluto, so we're bracketing Uranus for a minute, Saturn with Pluto, it tends to bring in periods of crisis and contraction, division and othering. It can be a period of conservative empowerment, as well as a period of facing the shadow and justice and moral courage, as well as themes of the conservation of nature. And when Saturn and Pluto have come into alignment, we often see it correlate with major geopolitical wars and international conflicts. So just to give you a few examples, the First World War began under a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. The Second World War began under a Saturn-Pluto square. The Vietnam War began under a Saturn-Pluto opposition. The Falklands War took place under a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. 9/11 took place under the next Saturn-Pluto opposition. So you can see every time Saturn and Pluto come together, it tends to correlate with these really major contractions and conflicts and difficulties. And this decade we just came out of came crashing to an end with Saturn joining that Uranus-Pluto alignment. In fact, it was a triple conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto that correlated most clearly with the coronavirus pandemic. And so in 2020, this carried all the hallmarks of a Saturn-Pluto era. The level of crisis and global effect comparable to the world wars, both of which started under Saturn-Pluto alignments. It also echoed previous pandemics and epidemics, such as the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s that correlated with a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Or we can go back 7 centuries to the bubonic plague, which started in China in 1333 under a Saturn-Pluto opposition, and then moved to Europe during the subsequent conjunction of 1348 to 51. So again, these themes of epidemics, pandemics, correlating with Saturn, Pluto. It's really about the struggle for survival. Now, sometimes knowing that an alignment such as Saturn, Pluto is in the sky, this can inspire fear, especially when we see how such alignments have correlated with wars and conflicts and epidemics in the past. However, I believe that such astrological knowledge, it also provides us with an opportunity, because Saturn, Pluto is about facing the shadow, about facing the difficult things, the things that are hidden that we need to look at, both within ourselves, but also collectively. And so not just during Saturn Pluto eras, but during all astrological eras, the more we're able to each do our inner work of withdrawing our projections and shining light upon these hidden dark regions of who we are, the less likely this is to manifest in the external world. So we're given the fortitude and the moral ethos to face what's unfolding in the collective. And we can recognize that these powerful archetypal movements are at work. And we can also trust that such periods come to an end, that this also will pass. And so it's relevant to say that this most recent Saturn-Pluto conjunction left the operative orb of influence this past December. So what came into the sky that correlated with the pandemic has since separated. Now, moving into the present moment, all of that building toward what's going on right now. The dominant outer planetary alignment I'll be speaking about today is the alignment of the planets Saturn, again. So Saturn, hard, concrete, material reality, what brings up boundaries and endings and losses, but also maturation, responsibility. So Saturn and Uranus. Uranus, again, being the awakener, the rebel, the trickster. So Saturn and Uranus, they're really different archetypes, and they're very contradictory to each other. Now, again, this wasn't, or I should say, this Saturn-Uranus alignment, they've been forming a square, which is a 90-degree angle, and that's been in the sky since early 2020. Now, as I said, this isn't the major alignment that defined 2020 and correlated with the onset of the pandemic. That was this rare Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto triple conjunction that fortunately will not repeat in our lifetimes. But the Saturn-Uranus square came in underneath that alignment, correlating with some of the destabilization we began to feel at that time and pointing toward the cracks in seemingly enduring structures and institutions and infrastructure and social systems. So again, this is a world transit, which means these are the transits affecting the collective, affecting all of Earth's inhabitants. Now, Saturn will be square to Uranus. That alignment will be here through 2023. It was the most dominant transit last year. It actually made 3 exact alignments in February, in June, and December. And Saturn, Uranus, they'll come back together in almost exact alignment this October. But even now, as they're several degrees a little further apart, the archetypal zeitgeist, the qualities are still quite palpable, I think. Now, Saturn and Uranus are in this kind of square dance with each other throughout these years. And it's correlating with the dynamic tensions that are generally characteristic of the nature of the 90-degree square, where these planets are at an adjacent angle to each other, but it's also very much the nature of these particular planets. So Saturn and Uranus, who are just radically opposite archetypal principles. Now, the nature of the Saturn-Uranus dynamic is one of schisms and sudden breaks. It's unexpected crises. It's the breakdown of old structures, but it's also breakthroughs to new enduring realities. And we've been seeing this play out around the world in the last couple of years in many different ways. And we're seeing it in especially stark relief during these recent days as new conflicts arise and sovereign borders, Saturn, and boundaries are suddenly broken and shattered. When Saturn and Uranus combine, as is currently occurring, the archetypal complex of Saturn-Uranus can be understood as the sudden and unexpected collapse of old structures. It's crisis, but it's also crisis management. It's innovative restructuring. It's the balance between discipline and creativity. It's about revolution within the system. And we also see it come through in tensions between the old and the new, or between the young and the old, or between the future and the past, traditionalism and futurism, or conservatism and progressivism. And again, we've been seeing this play out in the last couple of years in various forms. We often see economic crashes correlate with Saturn-Uranus alignments. So sometimes intensely dramatic crashes when Pluto is involved in the mix, such as the Great Depression or the Great Recession, as well as our own current unstable economic situation. Because Saturn-Uranus brings a course correction. It's a kind of bursting of the bubble. It's a deflation, whether that deflation is of the economy or of the ego or of an ideology or a political campaign or scientific or psychological theory or even a paradigm. Saturn-Uranus, if you're interested at all in the tarot, Saturn-Uranus is like the tower card in the tarot. So you can think of the long endurance of the stone tower, only to be suddenly and unexpectedly struck by lightning, bringing the tall structure crashing down. So Saturn is that stone tower, Uranus is that lightning. Now, Saturn-Uranus can manifest as literal crashes and accidents of cars, trains, airplanes. The Chernobyl nuclear accident took place on April 26, 1986, at the beginning of the last Saturn-Uranus conjunction. On the day of the meltdown, the moon was actually conjunct Saturn and moving toward Uranus. Another example of this is the Fukushima meltdown in 2011 that occurred right at the end of the Saturn-Uranus opposition. It was greatly intensified by the T-square to Pluto. Overall, Saturn-Uranus conflicts tend to be more internal to a nation or a disputed region, correlating more with civil wars and uprisings, rather than geopolitical and international conflicts, which are more likely to correlate with Saturn-Pluto alignments, such as the world wars, as I was saying before. So we can see this Saturn-Uranus correlation with the Bolshevik Revolution in the second decade of the 20th century, or the Korean War in the 1950s, although of course there was external influence there as well. We can see it in the buildup to the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s, or the Persian Constitutional Revolution in the early 20th century, or the breakup of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, or significantly, the US Civil War in the 1860s, which took place under a Saturn-Uranus square like the one we have in the sky now. I think we can recognize Saturn-Uranus in Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, with the Saturnian constrictions on Ukrainian freedom on the one hand, but also the extraordinary strength and tenacity of Ukrainian resistance to protect and preserve those freedoms on the other hand. Saturn-Uranus can also be the positive reform that's needed so that an old system can be changed in liberating ways. So an example of this is Perestroika, which was the reformation program of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that took place under the last conjunction of Saturn-Uranus in the second half of the 1980s. So this actually, Perestroika led to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which was not only under a Saturn-Uranus conjunction, but in a beautiful alignment in which both Jupiter and Neptune were involved as well. So we can see the quality of Saturn-Uranus in that literally a wall, a structure, a boundary, which is Saturn, being broken, being taken down in that Uranian sense, and indicating a kind of freedom that took place in that moment. Now, as I said, Jupiter and Uranus were involved in that alignment also in 1989. And so that brings me to the other alignment that's unfolding this year, that's kind of gently washing in like soft honey waves over a parched landscape. Very different. This is the conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune that quietly began in January and is coming into exact alignment just in a few weeks in April. It'll eventually leave the orb of influence in February of next year. So it's about a year-long transit. And we'll feel this the most in March, April, and May. And then again, it'll touch in October, November, and December of this year. So Neptune, the archetypal principle of Neptune, relates to the spiritual. It's the transcendent. It's the sacred. It's the numinous. Neptune is the magical and the mystical. Neptune is related to the imagination. It's the wellspring of images. And Neptune is symbolized by water. So it's very merging and flowing and dissolving of whatever it touches. It can be related to, because it's connected to the image, it can be related to the mirage or illusion or delusion or deception. So we have to be careful with Neptune, this kind of watery image, invisible, ineffable kind of quality. And then Jupiter amplifies or makes bigger what it touches. It celebrates what it's in relationship to, brings all the good things in. Jupiter relates to growth, expansion, it's the heights, it's elitism, it's royalty, abundance, riches. Jupiter, if it has a shadow side, it's when it becomes too much, too big, too inflated, too arrogant. So these two planets are coming into this shorter alignment this year. And these conjunctions occur every 13 years. So you can just kind of go back in your mind, 2009, 1997, 1984, 1971, 1958. These were the years that these conjunctions happened. And to give you a metaphor of what Jupiter and Neptune is kind of like, imagine slipping into a hot tub at the end of a hard day's work. The warm water and the relaxation, maybe you sit back with a glass of wine or something else that helps relax you or bring you into a slightly altered state of consciousness. You look up at the stars dazzling above you. There's this sense of unity and oneness and ease that's present there. But it doesn't take away the problems that you are working on during the day. In other words, the Saturn-Uranus alignment we've been talking about, it's still there. But we have something else to escape into for a time, to feel a sense of ease and creativity and greater spiritual connection and context around that. So qualities of Jupiter Neptune can be a kind of idealistic optimism or grand visions and ideals and aspiration. There's a kind of richness of the imagination that comes in during these time periods. They often tend to be times of spiritual growth, or positive spiritual experiences, or religious pluralism. They can be times of social compassion too, which we definitely need right now. I think in some ways we're seeing in the outpouring of response to what's happening in Ukraine. You can see the two different archetypal qualities coming in with this outpouring of international compassion. It also can be a period of a re-enchantment of culture. But we have to watch out during these periods because it can also be a time of viewing the world through rose-colored glasses. So having grand illusions or delusions and deceptions on a large scale, especially with money. So there can be issues with gambling or unsafe investment or excessive religious expenditure. It can be a time of grand escapist fantasies or a naive belief in anything. It can sometimes be a period where there's an abundance of use of substances that bring us into a non-ordinary state of consciousness, whether that's excessive psychedelic use or excessive alcohol and drug use, or a kind of overindulgence and escapist fantasy into like the desire for an oceanic ecstasy or bliss. Now, for those who work with a contemplative spiritual practice, for example, with meditation or active imagination, theurgy, or with sacred medicine and expanded states of consciousness, this transit can potentially bring a very profound sense of safety, being held in the womb of the cosmos, a sense of divine unity, of sacred meaning. And there's more of an ease of connection to spirit and the divine. So we have these two very different outer planetary alignments that are reflecting the state of our world today. So on the one hand, how can we use the spiritual riches that are offered by the Jupiter-Neptune alignment to refill our well springs with the strength and inspiration and imagination that we need to face the ongoing struggles and the collapsing systems of our time? And also, how can we draw upon Saturn-Uranus to reform and restructure our institutions, making these hard changes that are necessary so we can live more freely and yet with a greater sense of responsibility in the world. So we're currently in what's called the waning square of the Saturn-Uranus cycle. So all of the planets move in cycles with each other, just like the sun and the moon. And so just like the waning square with the moon, where it's moving toward the new moon, we're in the waning square of Saturn with Uranus. And in 2030 to 2034, so less than a decade from now, there will be a Saturn-Uranus conjunction, the first since the conjunction of the late 1980s that correlated with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, that upcoming conjunction will mark the closing of this Saturn-Uranus cycle, and it'll be the birth of a new one. So because right now we're in the waning square and we'll be in that through 2023, these next couple years may still be more expressed by the tension of opposites, by polarities and schisms, and by these breaks with the past. But we need these breaks in order to actually be able to move forward, to be able to take responsibility for the kinds of enduring changes that we want and need to see in the world. So we can think of it in this archetypal sense that only with death, which is Saturn, can come rebirth, which is Uranus. So perhaps the prayer is, may we recognize and honor both of these principles as we learn to dance with them in our lives. So I will stop there. I know I threw a ton of information at you. Hopefully some of that sticks. And really what I want to encourage and what I say to people that I work with as clients is sometimes it can just be helpful to remember the feeling you had in response to something. You might not remember the name of a particular planet or alignment, but just that archetypal feeling in response, because at some intuitive and imaginative level, you do know this. It is part of you. These archetypal principles live through you, and they live through each of us in unique forms. And so that in itself may be the main takeaway. I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions or comments or clarifications if you have them. There's a couple different ways we could do this. You're welcome to pop a question in the chat if you would like. You're also just welcome to raise your hand. We have a nice cozy group, so we can just bring this forward into dialogue if you wish. Yeah, again, any comments or questions, things that might be helpful to clarify or go back over. And we have a little bit of time to do that. So thank you all for listening.
I see Chloe has her hand up.
I think she might just be clapping, depending on the reaction.
Just sharing my gratitude.
You are most welcome. Thank you. And let me just say, like, no question is too simple. It doesn't have to be about something I said. It can be about astrology in general. But if you're thinking it, I bet you someone else here is thinking it as well. Yeah.
I have one. What I'm always very fascinated. I tend to forget things like Neptune and its qualities, and it's nice to be reminded of them in their context with astrology. What sort of tarot correspondences does Neptune or might Neptune have? Just general.
I mean, very generally speaking, it would kind of relate to the whole suit of cups because of that connection to the element of water. I'm just trying to think if there's another one that would be more specific, especially from the major arcana. I don't work with tarot professionally. I'll just say that. I do it in my own private use. So that's kind of the main correlation I can think of right now. There may be some decks that do tie in with Neptune, but the tarot is also older than our discovery of Neptune, which was discovered in 1846. And so since 1846, astrologers have been distilling what the meaning of it is, researching through world history and numerous birth charts and so forth. So it may not be as incorporated as other, the inner planets, which are very intentionally incorporated into the tarot. Yeah, that's a good question.
Oh, I see something in the chat. Let's see.
Mm. Oh, these are great questions.
You want to just pick one?
Sure. Well, from Juliet, the question of how do I see Neptune as affecting the COVID pandemic? In a few different ways. During 2020, Mars made some significant alignments to Neptune in the middle of the year, which I noticed correlated with some more kind of rapid spread because Neptune dissolves boundaries. And so correlated with a more rapid spread during those periods. The way I've been noticing it now, and this also brings in the Saturn Uranus, but the Saturn Pluto that was in the sky when COVID started, that ended in December. And right around that time, that's when the deeply imprisoning feeling of the lockdowns and so forth also shifted. Then we shifted more into this dominant Saturn Uranus period. It's been a little bit more like, well, we don't know what the rules are and we're changing the rules and let's try this. Oh, no, let's try that. There's a bit more of that back and forth crisis situation. The way that Jupiter Neptune seems to be coming in is more of that relaxed state. We're opening up, things are easing a bit more. We got a little taste of this last year, actually, when when Jupiter dipped into Pisces, which is the same sign that Neptune is in. It was only in there for 2 months. And that was the window between lifting the mask mandate in May and Delta emerging. And so right as Jupiter left the sign of Pisces, where it's co-present with Neptune, we all went back in. Now Jupiter's in Pisces with Neptune. And my concern is that same with that kind of rose-colored glasses, like it's over, this is different, this is wonderful, we can all merge again and hug and love each other. And I'm worried that that dissolving boundary quality may bring up issues, that this isn't totally over, the crisis hasn't ended. And so that we have to keep our reality hats on when it comes to Neptune. Where it is helpful is in the realms of spirituality and in the realms of prayer and contemplation and mystical experience. That's where it helps us. It doesn't help us when it comes to figuring out pandemic policies, international war conflict policies, good financial investments, things like that. Now, another question from Elizabeth, thank you. How does a Saturn-Uranus square as a transit affect a person who has that in their chart? I can speak to that from very personal experience. I was born with Saturn Uranus. And there can be just a feeling of resonance, like, oh my goodness, the world is kind of what it's like to be me right now. There can be a lot of feeling of like, yes, no, back and forth. But it also can be a time, and this can be applied to any archetypal complex. People tend to come into their own during periods when there's something in the sky they were born with. We see that like Uranus-Pluto eras, people born with Uranus-Pluto tend to come forward as leaders of their revolutionary movement during the next Uranus-Pluto alignment, whether that's Mary Wollstonecraft writing Vindication of the Rights of Woman, or Betty Friedan writing The Feminine Mystique, or Barack Obama coming into the presidency. He's born with Uranus-Pluto, came into power under the next one. So there's a feeling of resonance. Like right now, President Biden has Saturn Uranus. Interestingly, Bernie Sanders has Saturn Uranus. AOC has Saturn Uranus. All these people who are on the train of the New Deal, the Green New Deal, actually echoes when there was a Saturn Uranus alignment, and FDR, born with Saturn Uranus, brought forward the New Deal. So there's this mirroring between the New Deal and the Green New Deal. Again, the revolutionary is changing within the system. It can be the quiet revolutionary. And so for someone born with the aspect during a period like that, you may find yourself drawn into situations where you're bridge building, you're holding perspectives between like the old and the new and the young and the old, and kind of situated between those worlds. So that can be some of that experience. Let me see. There was another question from Diane about health. How do the planets relate to health? Now, this is a huge question. There's a whole field of medical astrology. There's also a number of transits that will relate to ill health or health challenges, but there isn't just any one thing. I can't say like, oh, if you have this, you're definitely going to have ill health. Typically, we see Saturn involved because Saturn relates to problems, difficulties, suffering, sickness. We often see the moon involved because the moon relates to the body, to kind of our embodied experience, the emotions, the digestive system. Mars we'll see sometimes involved because Mars relates to our vital physical energy. So how much energy we have, our kind of athletic ability. If something's transiting that, we may be more likely to be injured or have less energy, or our energy is more diffuse. So that's kind of just a hint at it, but you can see there is a relationship to health that comes in. But sometimes you might be getting a transit coming in, you think, wow, this is going to be a major health issue, and it ends up being something totally different that's still archetypally relevant. So it's a very kind of individual question. Maybe if there's just one more closing question before we wrap things up.
I have just a general one. Are there any, for anyone interested in, maybe beginning to study it, astrology, or just paying attention to it, are there any favorite resources for you, like introductory texts or any kind of text or podcasts, or the things that you would like to recommend? Maybe a favorite thing or two?
Absolutely. There are probably more than, my cat is attacking a fly over in the corner. If you hear banging all of a sudden, I'm a second generation astrologer. So my father's an astrologer, and he wrote a book called Cosmos and Psyche. It's by Richard Tarnas. And maybe I'll just pop these in the chat so you can see that. So Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. It's an introduction to, it's written for people who are new to astrology, but it's a very kind of academic text as well. And it's an introduction to different planetary alignments through history. So 4 different alignments through history. A bit along the lines of what I've done today, but not all the same alignments. In terms of podcasts, the Astrology podcast that's run by Chris Brennan is an amazing resource. He brings together so many different astrologers to speak on his podcast. So that's actually a really great introduction to astrology in general. He has a number of beginners videos. He's a Hellenistic astrologer. So he works within a more traditional approach to astrology, which is he's been part of a movement to recover all these ancient texts and techniques in the last 20 years. But he brings in a lot of different astrologers. So you can get a sense for archetypal astrology versus evolutionary astrology versus modern psychological astrology or Vedic astrology. Like there's so many astrologies. Honestly, the best place to start is to get a good reading from an astrologer who's been highly recommended to you. In fact, I would recommend getting several readings from different astrologers so you can compare what they're saying. And that's really the best introduction, because you get to know it through your own birth chart and your own life. And that is a way for you to verify what's being said in a way that will feel deeply personal and often very transformative too. So there's a lot of great astrologers out there. I no longer give readings, so I can't recommend myself, but Google archetypal astrologers. Yeah, there are so many great astrologers these days, but try and get a recommendation too, if you can, just so that what's being offered. Maybe listen to some episodes of the Astrology podcast, and if you're like, oh, I resonate with that person, that's the person to go find. So that would be my suggestion for how to start exploring astrology more deeply.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for coming out today. And thank you for everyone watching the recording who are in the future. Hello.
How are you going to get a copy of the recording?
It'll be posted, I believe, on Monday, and we'll have some show notes to repeat what was in the chat and some of the resources mentioned. We have Cosmos and Psyche in the library. I've heard the audiobook. It's tremendous. And I've heard Brennan on other podcasts, and I was always intrigued by his book. And I keep forgetting to bring it in to the library, but I will do so. And of course, lastly, Becca, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. It was enchanting and it was re-enchanting. It's so nice to be able to reconnect with these ideas, you know, when we don't necessarily study them all the time, because they make such wonderful sense, and you communicated everything so poetically and brilliantly. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you as well.
I'm sorry. Can I ask a quick question? I came in late. Did you do any personal readings, you know, projections for people in the talk?
No, I focused on the world transits because that's what affects everybody. And a personal reading is a very kind of intimate and personal affair. So it's best to do in a confidential container. So yeah, I was speaking to the collective situation and the historical situation.
I hope it was positive.
It's a mix of things.
Yeah.
You can hear the recording.
I will listen. Yeah.
You came in at the end, but I absolutely cannot recommend everything to go back to check it out when it comes out.
Yeah.
It'll be on Altadena Library District. It'll be on our YouTube page, and I believe it should be up tomorrow.
Thank you.
All righty.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, have a lovely solstice Sunday. And thank you again, Becca.
The solstice.
Happy spring equinox.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.